The day I became Alexander Sinclair's wife, I thought my life was beginning. I had been raised to believe in love, in loyalty, in the kind of marriage where two souls intertwined, where devotion meant something. So when I walked down that long aisle draped in white lace, my heart beating like the wings of a caged bird, I thought I was stepping into something sacred. I was wrong. The moment the wedding ended, something in him changed. The man who had once whispered soft promises in my ear now barely acknowledged me. He held my hand only for the sake of appearances, his grip firm but devoid of warmth. His emerald green eyes no longer sought mine with affection, but with the cool detachment of a businessman assessing a transaction. I told myself it was just an adjustment, that every marriage took time, that he had responsibilities, his company, his empire, the weight of his family name. But on our wedding night, when we returned to the grand estate that was now my home, he left me alone in our bedroom. Without a word. Without a kiss. The heavy doors closed behind him and I stood there in my wedding gown, staring at the empty space where my husband should have been. That was the first crack in the illusion. The days that followed only made it worse. I had expected to be a wife, a partner, someone who stood beside him. Instead, I was treated as an accessory. A perfectly polished figure to accompany him at dinners, to smile at his colleagues, to be admired from a distance but never truly seen. When I spoke to him, his responses were brief, detached. When I reached for his hand, he pulled away as if my touch was an afterthought. But what cut the deepest wasn't his coldness. It was his indifference. It was the way he never asked how I felt, never turned to me in the quiet hours of the night, never looked at me like I was his. I was invisible. The house itself became a cage. A vast, sprawling estate filled with marble floors and towering chandeliers, but it was not my home. It was a place where I existed, where I was expected to be present but never to truly live. The staff were polite but distant, following his lead. The people in his social circle barely acknowledged me, treating me as though I was a piece of expensive decor rather than a person with thoughts, with emotions. And Alexander? He acted as though marrying me had been a duty, nothing more. I tried to reach him. I tried to understand. Is there something wrong? I asked one evening as he sat in his study reviewing documents. He barely looked up. No. I swallowed. Then why do you treat me like this? He exhaled slowly, placing his pen down. His gaze met mine, unreadable. Like what? Like I don't exist, I whispered. Something flickered across his face. Something unreadable, something gone too quickly to name. And then just as quickly he turned back to his papers. You're overthinking. Dismissed. That night, I lay awake in the cold expanse of our bed, staring at the ceiling. I had married a stranger. And no matter how hard I tried, he would never love me. A month passed. Then another. And then, just when I thought I had been completely swallowed by the silence of my marriage, Liam returned. Liam Carter had been my childhood friend. The boy who had once chased fireflies with me on summer nights, the one who had laughed with me when the world felt small and full of wonder. I had not seen him in years. But when I stepped into the town's small cafe one afternoon, needing a break from the suffocating walls of my home, there he was. Sitting by the window sipping coffee, looking like he belonged to a different life. A life filled with warmth, with color, with something that had been missing from mine. When his honey-brown eyes met mine, they widened in surprise, then softened into something I hadn't felt in so long. Recognition. Emma. My throat tightened. I had spent months being invisible. And now someone finally saw me. Liam's voice pulled me back to a version of myself I had almost forgotten. I hadn't heard my name spoken like that in months. With warmth, with familiarity. I hadn't been looked at like that in even longer. Like I was someone worth seeing. For a moment I stood frozen, my fingers tightening around the handle of my purse. I shouldn't be here. Alexander wouldn't care where I went, but he would notice if I was late. But then Liam smiled and just like that I sat down. The conversation started cautiously. Formal pleasantries, questions about how life had been. But soon it felt like no time had passed at all. His laugh still had the same boyish charm, his eyes still held the same quiet kindness. And for the first time in a long time I laughed too. Real laugh. The kind that made my chest ache because I had forgotten how it felt. When I told him I was married, something shifted in his expression. It was subtle, barely there, but I caught it. The way his lips pressed together for a fraction of a second, the way his fingers tensed slightly against the coffee cup. He didn't ask if I was happy. And I didn't offer an answer. Instead, I looked out the window watching the people outside go about their lives. Free. Unburdened. The moment passed and he smiled again, softer this time. He told me about his years abroad, about his return to town, about how nothing felt the same, but somehow with me here it almost did. I should have left sooner. I should have walked away before I got too comfortable, before I let myself remember what being alive felt like. But I didn't. I let myself stay just a little longer. When I finally stood to leave, Liam looked at me with something unreadable in his eyes. "I'll see you around?" I hesitated. Then I nodded. I wanted to. And that terrified me. When I returned home that evening, Alexander was already there, sitting in his study. The sight of him, the coldness, the quiet arrogance, was a stark contrast to the warmth I had just left behind. He glanced up when I walked in, his green eyes sharp, assessing. "You're late." My pulse stilled. He had never asked before. "I went into town," I said carefully, removing my coat. "Lost track of time." He said nothing, only studying me for a moment longer before returning to his work. And yet something had changed. The next few days I found myself thinking about Liam more than I should have. About the way he looked at me like I was real. About how easy it was to exist beside him. But it was nothing. A fleeting moment. A brief escape from a reality I had to accept. Or so I thought. The next week I ran into him again. This time it wasn't an accident. I had gone back to the cafe telling myself I just needed fresh air, that I wanted to feel normal again, even if only for a little while. And then there he was. The smile came without effort, and before I knew it I was sitting across from him once more. Time blurred. The afternoon melted into the early evening and I let myself forget. But I should have been more careful. Because when I finally returned home, Alexander was waiting for me. Not in his study. Not buried in work. But in the grand sitting room where I had no choice but to face him. I froze in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, his posture relaxed yet firm. And then, in a voice that was deceptively calm, he spoke. "Who is he?" A sharp chill ran down my spine. I tried to steady my breath, to keep my expression neutral. "What?" His green eyes darkened, cold amusement flickering beneath the surface. "The man you've been meeting." My heart slammed against my ribs. I had spent months being invisible to him. But now suddenly he had noticed. I swallowed hard, refusing to let him see the panic creeping up my throat. "I don't know what you're talking about." Alexander exhaled slowly, standing from his chair. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. "Don't lie to me." It wasn't anger in his voice. It wasn't jealousy. It was possession. Something in his gaze sent a warning through my veins. But I lifted my chin, forcing myself to meet his stare. "I am not lying," I said quietly. A tense silence stretched between us. Then he smiled. A slow, knowing curve of his lips. And then just like that he walked past me without another word. But I knew. Something had shifted. Something had woken up inside of him. And for the first time I felt afraid. Because I had seen it in his eyes. He wasn't angry that I had met someone else. He was angry that I had the nerve to think I could belong to anyone but him. And that was the moment I knew. I had to leave. Before it was too late. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was afraid of what Alexander would do. He wasn't the kind of man who raised his voice or acted impulsively. His power came from control, from silence, from the way he could strip a person of their will without ever lifting a hand. But for the first time since our wedding I had defied him. And I had seen something in his eyes that unsettled me. Possession. It wasn't love, wasn't jealousy. It was the realization that I was slipping from his grasp. That I was no longer the obedient wife he had assumed I would always be. The next morning I went through the motions as if nothing had changed. I ate breakfast in silence while he read the newspaper. I nodded when he mentioned his schedule for the day. I kissed his cheek as he left for work, my fingers light against his skin. And then as soon as the door closed behind him I started planning my escape. I had nothing. No real money of my own, no place to go, no one I could turn to without Alexander eventually finding out. But I wasn't stupid. I knew a man like him wouldn't let me go easily. If I left it had to be clean. No trace. No chance for him to drag me back. I started small. Each time I went into town I withdrew small amounts of cash from my personal account, careful never to raise suspicion. I bought a cheap prepaid phone, hiding it deep in my dresser. I took note of which doors creaked, which exits would be easiest to slip through unnoticed. I had one shot, and I had to get it right. Days passed. Then weeks. I didn't see Liam again. Not because I didn't want to, but because I knew Alexander was watching. I could feel it in the way his eyes lingered on me longer than before. In the way his questions came slower, deliberate, as if waiting for me to trip. And I almost did. One afternoon as I was leaving the bank, I heard someone call my name. Liam. I turned too quickly, my pulse leaping to my throat. He stood by the entrance, his brows furrowed, concern clear in his honey-brown eyes. "I've been looking for you," he said, his voice softer than I deserved. "You disappeared." Guilt curled deep inside me. He had been my one glimpse of warmth in a life that had turned cold, and I had walked away. I hesitated, glancing around. The street was crowded, but it didn't matter. I still felt like Alexander was there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for a reason to pull me back. Liam must have seen it in my face because he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Emma, are you okay?" I wanted to lie. To say yes. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, my fingers clenched around the strap of my bag, my nails digging into the leather. "I can't talk right now," I whispered. His jaw tensed. "Then when?" I hesitated. Then slowly I exhaled. "Tomorrow. Noon." He held my gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll be there." I turned and walked away, my heart pounding against my ribs. I shouldn't have agreed to meet him. It was reckless, dangerous. But I couldn't help it. Because deep down I knew that if anyone could help me escape, it was Liam. And I wasn't sure I could do it alone. I arrived at the cafe early. The air was crisp, the scent of fresh bread and coffee curling through the open doors. I sat by the window, my hands wrapped around a porcelain cup, my fingers cold despite the warmth of the drink. I had barely taken a sip when Liam walked in. He spotted me instantly, his honey-brown eyes darkening with something I couldn't quite name. Relief. Concern. Maybe even frustration. He slid into the chair across from me without hesitation, his presence steady, grounding. "You look different," he murmured, studying me. I let out a quiet breath. "I feel different." He didn't speak right away. He let the silence settle between us, giving me time. He always had a way of waiting, of letting me come to him on my own terms. But I couldn't afford to wait any longer. I set my cup down carefully. "I need to leave." Liam's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows on the table, his voice low. "Leave as in?" I swallowed hard. "As in disappear. As in never come back." His fingers curled against the table. "Because of him." It wasn't a question. I nodded anyway. A long exhale left his lips. He looked down, shaking his head slightly, then back up at me. "Emma, why didn't you tell me sooner?" I had no answer for that. Maybe because saying it out loud would have made it real. Maybe because part of me had been too ashamed. "I couldn't," I whispered. "But I'm telling you now." Liam didn't hesitate. "What do you need?" The question stunned me for a moment. Not why. Not are you sure? Just, what do you need? I forced my voice to stay steady. "Money. A place to stay. A way out that won't lead him straight to me." His jaw clenched, his eyes flickering with something unreadable. Then he nodded once. "Done." It was that simple. He didn't question it. Didn't push. Because Liam had always been this way. Unshakable. Steady. Mine in a way Alexander never had been. But I couldn't think about that now. We spent the next hour planning. Liam would book a hotel under his name in a city far enough away that Alexander wouldn't look immediately. I would slip out late at night, take the back roads, use cash for everything. We went over every detail, where I would go, how long I would stay hidden, what I would do if things went wrong. It was reckless. It was rushed. It was dangerous. But it was the only chance I had. When we stood to leave, Liam hesitated. "If you change your mind," he started, but I shook my head. "I won't." He searched my face, then nodded. "Tomorrow night," he said quietly. "I'll be waiting." I stepped outside, the wind cool against my face. The world felt different, sharper, more fragile. I had taken the first step. But deep down I knew Alexander wouldn't let me go so easily. The hours stretched endlessly. Every second that passed felt like a countdown, like the walls of the estate were pressing in closer. I moved carefully, methodically, ensuring that everything was set. I packed only the essentials. cash, identification, a change of clothes. Nothing that would raise suspicion if Alexander happened to notice. The rest I would leave behind. The thought of starting over with nothing should have terrified me, but it didn't. Not anymore. The night before my escape, Alexander was home early. I had barely stepped into the dining room when I felt his eyes on me. He was seated at the head of the long oak table, the candlelight flickering against the sharp angles of his face. His emerald green gaze followed me as I moved, unreadable, assessing. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his voice smooth but edged with something I couldn't place. I kept my expression neutral. "Have I?" His lips curved slightly, but it wasn't a smile. It was something else. Something more dangerous. "You have." I took my seat across from him, careful to maintain the same controlled poise he expected from me. I reached for my glass of wine, the stem cold beneath my fingers. "I suppose I've had a lot on my mind." Alexander leaned back, studying me. He was never a man of unnecessary words, but I could feel them behind his silence, weighing heavy between us. I forced myself to meet his gaze. I had spent months drowning in his indifference, but now that I was slipping through his fingers, he was finally paying attention. I took a slow sip of my wine, waiting. He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "I must have been a fool to think you'd sit quietly forever." The glass in my hand stilled. The air between us grew sharp, like the moment before a storm. And then, as if nothing had happened, he picked up his knife and cut into his steak, the tension vanishing as quickly as it had come. But the damage was done. He knew. Not everything. Not the details. But enough to sense that something was slipping beyond his control. I finished my meal, feigning calm, excusing myself as usual. But as I walked away, I could feel him watching me. Took everything in me not to run. That night I barely slept. I listened for movement beyond the door, for the sound of footsteps that never came. Every creak of the house sent my pulse hammering in my throat. By the time the first light of dawn seeped through the curtains, I had made a decision. I couldn't wait until nightfall. If I stayed any longer, he would find a way to stop me. So I did the only thing I could. I ran. The estate was quiet as I slipped through the back door, my breath measured, my pulse a hammering rhythm beneath my skin. I had spent months memorizing every exit, every security detail, every blind spot in the cameras. I moved quickly, my bag tucked against my side, the cold air biting at my skin. The moment my feet touched the gravel path beyond the garden, I knew there was no turning back. Liam was waiting at the edge of town. I had sent him a single message before slipping out. "I'm coming now." He had responded immediately. "I'll be there." The night stretched around me, the stars above unfamiliar, distant. My world was about to change. I barely made it past the estate's outer gates before headlights cut through the darkness. A sleek black car. My heart stopped. The tires skidded slightly as the vehicle pulled in front of me, blocking my path. The doors unlocked with a quiet click, and then I saw him. Alexander stepped out, his movements controlled, his emerald eyes dark in the dim glow of the streetlights. He wasn't wearing a coat, as if he had left in a hurry. As if he had known. I turned to run, but his voice cut through the night like a blade. "Emma." My feet froze against my will. He took a step toward me, slow, measured, like a predator who had already won the hunt. "You were going to leave me." His voice was calm, but there was something underneath it, something cold and sharp. I forced my spine to straighten. I was. The silence between us stretched dangerously. Then something flickered in his gaze, something almost unreadable. "And where exactly were you planning to go?" I swallowed, my fingers curling around the strap of my bag. "That's none of your concern." A bitter chuckle slipped from his lips, and then before I could react, he closed the distance between us. His hand wrapped around my wrist, not rough, not painful, but firm. Holding. Restraining. "You belong to me, Emma." The words were a whisper, but they carried the weight of something far heavier. I wrenched my arm back, stepping away. "I belong to myself." His jaw tightened. "You think you can just walk away?" My hands were shaking, but I clenched them into fists, forcing my voice to steady. "Yes." A tense silence stretched between us. And then to my horror he smiled. "You underestimate me," he murmured. A cold chill ran down my spine. Before I could move, before I could run, the sound of another car's engine roared in the distance. The headlights illuminated both of us as his car came to a sharp stop just feet away. The moment the door opened, I ran. Liam was out of the car in an instant, his eyes darting between me and Alexander. "Get in," he said, his voice tight. I didn't hesitate. I barely had time to buckle my seatbelt before Liam threw the car into gear and sped off, the tires screeching against the pavement. Through the side mirror, I saw Alexander standing exactly where I had left him. Watching. Waiting. And I knew this wasn't over. The car sped through the empty roads, the dark countryside blurring past as I tried to steady my breath. My hands clenched against my lap, fingers digging into the fabric of my coat. Liam's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his jaw clenched, his honey brown eyes flicking toward me every few seconds. "He was waiting for you." His voice was low, controlled, but I could hear the anger simmering beneath it. I swallowed hard. "I know." Silence filled the space between us. He knew what that meant. Alexander had suspected. Maybe not everything, maybe not the details of my escape plan, but he had known enough. And yet he had let me go. Not because he was letting me win, but because he was letting me run. Because he knew exactly what he would do next. Liam's knuckles were white against the wheel. "We need to put more distance between you and him." I nodded. "I've cash. Enough to last me for a while." His jaw tightened. "That won't be enough." Not against him. He was right. Alexander wasn't just a man. He was powerful, connected, relentless. A man who was used to getting what he wanted. And right now what he wanted was me. My stomach twisted as I exhaled. "I'll figure it out." Liam shook his head, his eyes dark. "No. We'll figure it out." The weight of those words settled deep in my chest. I had spent so long feeling alone, trapped in a marriage where I was nothing but a shadow. But sitting here in this car with Liam beside me, I wasn't alone anymore. The city lights appeared in the distance. Our first stop. The hotel Liam had booked for me under his name. A temporary solution, a place to disappear for a while before I figured out my next move. Liam pulled into the parking lot, shutting off the engine. He turned to me, his expression serious. "I can stay if you want me to." I hesitated. Not because I was afraid of him, but because I wasn't sure if I trusted myself. Not after what I had felt the moment I saw him again. Not after the way my heart had ached when he told me he had been waiting for me all these years. I forced a small smile. "I'll be okay." He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "Call me if anything feels off." I nodded. "I will." I stepped out of the car, my breath fogging in the cold air. The weight of exhaustion settled over me as I made my way toward the entrance. I was free. And yet deep down I knew. Alexander wasn't done with me. I had left him behind. But I could still feel his presence like a shadow stretching across my skin. Waiting. Hunting. And no matter how far I ran, he would come for me. The first 2 days in the hotel were quiet. Too quiet. I stayed in my room, the curtains drawn, the lights dimmed, my phone off except for the prepaid one Liam had given me. He checked in every few hours, making sure I was safe. But no matter how many times I reassured him, I couldn't shake the feeling that Alexander was already moving. And I was right. On the third day, everything shattered. I had just stepped out of the shower, my damp black hair cascading down my back, when a knock echoed against the door. My breath hitched. It was too soon for room service, and Liam wouldn't have knocked, he would have texted. I crept toward the peephole, my heart hammering. And then I saw him. Alexander. Standing there in a dark coat, his posture poised, composed, like he had all the time in the world. My stomach twisted violently. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. How had he found me? The knock came again, steady, deliberate. "Emma." His voice was calm, smooth, but I knew better than to trust it. "Open the door." I didn't move. Silence stretched between us. Things like a soft tiske, almost amused. "I know you're in there." My fingers clenched at my sides. I could call Liam, I could try to escape, but none of that mattered because he was already here. He had already won. A quiet click sounded from the lock. My breath caught. He had a key. Of course he did. I spun toward the bathroom, but before I could take a single step, the door opened behind me. He stepped inside, closing it gently behind him. The air felt thin. His emerald green eyes swept over me, taking in my damp hair, the oversized sweater I had thrown on. His expression remained unreadable, but the intensity in his gaze made my skin prickle. For a moment he said nothing. Just looked at me. Then finally he exhaled. "You ran." I forced my chin up. And you followed. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. You didn't actually think I would let you go, did you? My hands curled into fists. I don't belong to you. He stepped closer, slow and controlled the way he always did. Like he was circling his prey. No, he murmured. But you did. The words felt like ice against my skin. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to hold my ground. Leave. He tilted his head slightly. And if I don't? The defiance in my chest burned, but my pulse betrayed me, hammering beneath my ribs. He could see it. He always could. His voice softened, but the danger remained beneath it. I would have given you anything, Emma. Anything. And yet you still ran. My throat tightened. You never gave me what mattered. Something flickered in his eyes. A crack in the mask. A glimpse of something deeper, something raw. And then just as quickly it was gone. His hand lifted, fingertips ghosting over my wrist. Not holding, not forcing. Just a touch. A reminder. Come home. The words were quiet. Almost gentle. A command disguised as an offer. I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. No. The silence between us grew heavier, stretching into something thick and suffocating. Then finally he sighed. And for the first time since he arrived, he stepped back. A slow, reluctant retreat. But I knew him. This wasn't surrender. This was a warning. He reached for the door handle but paused, glancing at me over his shoulder. His emerald gaze was sharp, unreadable. This isn't over. And then just like that he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him. But the air still felt thick with his presence. I let out a shaky breath, pressing a hand against my chest. I had won this round. But Alexander Sinclair never walked away from something he wanted. And I had just become his obsession. Liam arrived 20 minutes after Alexander left. I had barely managed to steady my breathing when a sharp knock rattled the door. This time I didn't hesitate, I knew it was him. I threw the door open, and the moment he saw my face, his expression darkened. He was here, he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. My hands were still shaking. Liam stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. His presence was solid, grounding, but I could see the anger simmering beneath the surface. He ran a hand through his golden brown hair, exhaling harshly. What did he say? I swallowed. That this isn't over. A muscle ticked in Liam's jaw. His fists clenched at his sides, like he was barely holding himself back. He just walked in? He had a key. His eyes flashed with something dangerous. Of course he did. Silence stretched between us. Then without another word, Liam moved. He reached for my bag, the one I had barely unpacked, zipping it up with swift, determined motions. We're leaving. I blinked. Liam. No, Emma. His voice was firm, final. He found you in 2 days. You think he won't do it again? I swallowed hard. I wanted to argue, to tell him I could handle this. But the truth was I couldn't. Not alone. So I nodded. Liam didn't waste another second. He grabbed my hand, leading me out the door, down the stairwell, out into the cold night air where his car was already waiting. We drove in silence, the roads stretching endlessly ahead. I didn't ask where we were going. I didn't need to. Anywhere but here was enough. Hours passed. The sky shifted from inky black to a soft gray, the first hints of dawn creeping over the horizon. Liam finally pulled into a quiet town, the streets empty, the world still asleep. He parked outside a small inn, switching off the engine before turning to face me. We stay here for now, he said quietly. I nodded. My body was exhausted, but my mind was restless. Liam studied me for a moment, his honey-brown eyes searching mine. Then slowly he reached out, his fingers brushing against my wrist, the same spot Alexander had touched just hours ago. But Liam's touch was different. Warmer. You're safe, he murmured. Something inside me cracked. The weight of the last few days, the months of suffocation, the years of being invisible, it all crashed down at once. I sucked in a sharp breath, pressing a hand to my mouth, trying to hold it in. But Liam saw. And without hesitation he pulled me into his arms. I didn't resist. For the first time in what felt like forever, I let someone hold me. I let myself breathe. But deep down I knew the truth. Alexander wouldn't stop. He had let me run once. He wouldn't let me go again. The small inn became a fragile illusion of safety. For 2 days I existed in borrowed time in a world where Alexander hadn't yet reached. The air was lighter here, the silence no longer suffocating. But the fear never truly left me. Liam kept close, his presence steady, unwavering. He didn't push, didn't force me to talk, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes flickered toward the door every time there was movement outside. He was waiting just like I was. And then on the third day it happened. A single knock. Not urgent. Not forceful. But deliberate. I froze. Liam was already on his feet before I could speak, his body positioned between me and the door. He didn't have to look at me to know. Alexander had found me. Liam's jaw clenched as he exhaled sharply. Stay here. I should have let him handle it. But something in me snapped at the thought of hiding while Alexander stood on the other side of that door, still believing he had a claim to me. So before Liam could stop me, I stepped forward and opened it. Alexander stood there, dressed in black, his emerald green eyes unreadable. He looked the same, but something was different. His usual arrogance was gone. His confidence, still present but dimmed, no longer unshakable. For the first time he looked desperate. Neither of us spoke at first. The moment stretched too long, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then his gaze flickered past me, landing on Liam standing just a few feet behind. His expression hardened. Of course it's you. Liam didn't flinch. Leave. Alexander didn't move. His eyes met mine again, searching, demanding. Emma. Come home. The words sent a chill through me, but I wasn't the same woman who had once feared him. I shook my head slowly. No. His jaw tightened. You don't mean that. Liam stepped closer, his voice sharp. She does. Alexander's hands curled into fists, but his expression remained composed. He exhaled, running a hand through his dark brown hair, his voice softer when he spoke again. I never wanted this. A bitter laugh slipped from my lips before I could stop it. No, you just wanted me to sit there, silent and obedient, while you ignored me. He flinched. It was slight, almost imperceptible, but I saw it. I didn't realize. He stopped himself, his frustration visible. I should have. But you didn't. My voice was firm, steady. And now it's too late. A thick silence followed. Then his hands relaxed and he sighed, something close to defeat settling in his eyes. Tell me what I can do to fix this. It was a plea, not a demand. And for the first time I saw the truth. Alexander had spent so long controlling everything, so long believing he could bend the world to his will, that he had never considered what would happen if I simply chose to leave. But this wasn't about what he wanted anymore. I stepped back, the distance between us final. There's nothing you can do. The words felt like freedom. Alexander's lips parted slightly, but he didn't argue. He only stared at me as if he was finally beginning to understand that he had already lost. Liam moved closer, standing beside me. His presence was solid, unshakable. The kind of presence that had never made me feel small. Alexander's gaze flickered between us one last time. Then slowly he stepped back. I held my breath. And then, without another word, he turned and walked away. The moment the door closed, the weight on my chest lifted. The air felt clearer, my limbs lighter. I had made my choice. And for the first time in my life I was finally free. The room was silent long after Alexander left. I didn't move, didn't breathe, as if any sudden motion might undo what had just happened. But the weight in my chest, the constant, suffocating pressure that had lived there for so long, was finally gone. Liam stood beside me, his gaze locked on the door as if expecting Alexander to return. His body was tense, his fists still clenched at his sides. But when he turned to me, his expression softened. He's gone, he said, as if I needed to hear it aloud to believe it. I nodded slowly, exhaling a shaky breath. I know. But somewhere deep inside I also knew Alexander never truly lost. Not in his mind. Because men like him didn't believe in defeat. I sat down on the edge of the bed, my hands still trembling slightly. The adrenaline had begun to wear off, leaving behind exhaustion so deep it felt like it might pull me under. Liam sat beside me, not too close, not too far. Just there. A silent reminder that I wasn't alone. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. Neither of us spoke. Then finally he did. What now? It was the question I had been avoiding. Because I didn't know. I had spent so much time running, planning, escaping, that I had never once considered what came next. For so long, My world had revolved around Alexander, whether it was pleasing him, fearing him, or leaving him. And now he was gone. The emptiness that followed wasn't sadness. It wasn't regret. It was freedom. I lifted my gaze to Liam, meeting his steady, patient eyes. He was waiting not for an answer he wanted, but for the one I was ready to give. I didn't have one. So instead I asked a question of my own. What would you do if you were me? Liam's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. I'd start over. The words settled into my bones, grounding me. Start over. Not rebuild from the ruins Alexander had left behind. Not reclaim something that had never belonged to me in the first place. But build something new. I exhaled, nodding. Yeah. For the first time in years I had a choice. And for the first time in years I chose myself. The days that followed felt surreal. For the first time in years I woke up without fear pressing against my ribs. Without the weight of a man's silence suffocating me. Alexander hadn't reached out. No messages, no calls, no sudden appearances. It was as if he had vanished from my life as quickly as I had disappeared from his. But I knew better. His absence wasn't surrender. It was acceptance. A realization that he had lost, that no amount of power, control, or calculated words could bring me back to him. I didn't look back. Instead, I moved forward. Liam stayed by my side, never pressuring, never asking for more than I was ready to give. He drove me to the coast one morning, where the sea stretched endlessly before us, a symbol of the life waiting beyond the wreckage of my past. We walked along the shore, the sand cool beneath my bare feet, the waves crashing softly against the rocks. It was quiet, peaceful. And then, as if he could hear the thoughts running through my mind, Liam spoke. You don't have to be afraid anymore. I turned to him, the wind lifting strands of my black hair around my face. His honey-brown eyes held the same quiet strength they always had. But there was something else there now. Something unspoken. Something that had always been there, waiting. I know, I whispered. He hesitated, searching my face. And what else do you know? The answer came so easily, so naturally, that I almost laughed at how blind I had been for so long. I know that you love me. Liam didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. But he didn't deny it. And that was all the confirmation I needed. For years I had been unseen, unheard, unloved. But he had always seen me. Always cared. Always waited, even when I hadn't realized I needed him to. A slow smile tugged at my lips as I stepped closer, feeling something unfamiliar but welcome settle deep inside my chest. For the first time in my life, love wasn't a cage. It wasn't ownership. It wasn't a transaction. It was freedom. And this time I chose it. I chose him. Liam exhaled, something breaking in his expression, something raw and real. And when he finally reached for me, pulling me into his arms, I didn't flinch. I didn't hesitate. Because this time I wasn't running away. I was running toward something new. Something mine. And I was finally home.